Michigan Bean Commission welcomes you to the Bean Academy webinar series. We are delighted that you are joining us for the inaugural webinar in this series for Bean Academy. Our first presenter is going to be Dr. Richard Mattis, and this is Barbara Ivins, registered dietitian, and your host for this series. The Bean Academy webinars are brought to you by the Michigan Bean Commission. They're pleased to offer this series of free or accredited webinars, many with a plant-forward eating focus that cover a broad range of contemporary nutrition and food topics. Webinars are a blend of research, science, and practice to help nutrition professionals stay informed on recent developments on relevant events. The webinars are funded as part of a USDA grant to the Michigan Bean Commission. A few logistics related to the webinar. A handout of the slides presented today is available at the michiganbean.com health professional website. The continuing education credit certificate is available to download after the webinar, also at the michiganbean.com/health professional section of the website. Dr. Mattis is glad to answer questions at the end of this webinar. Please submit questions by using the Q&A feature on your computer screen. I'd now like to introduce our distinguished faculty for today's webinar, Dr. Richard Mattis. Dr. Mattis is a distinguished professor of nutrition science at Purdue University, adjunct associate professor of medicine at the Indiana University School of Medicine, and affiliated scientist at the Monell Chemical Senses Center. His research focuses on the areas of taste function, hunger, satiety, food preferences, regulation of food intake in humans, and human cephalic phase responses. At Purdue, Dr. Mattis is the head of the Department of Public Health and director of the Ingestive Behavior Research Center. Outside of Purdue, he was a member of the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. He is the past president of the American Society of Nutrition and secretary of the Rosemarie Pangborn Sensory Science Scholarship Fund. Dr. Mattis has authored over 280 publications. He earned his undergraduate degree in biology and a master's degree in public health from the University of Michigan, as well as a doctoral degree in human nutrition from Cornell University. He conducted postdoc research studies at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and the Monell Chemical Senses Center. The learning objectives for today's webinar is to describe the process for formulating national dietary recommendations, to identify the contribution of added sugars and their moderation to meet dietary goals, discuss the trends in eating frequency and their health implications, list and describe the fundamental dietary patterns which are identified by the Dietary Guidelines Committee that contribute to positive health outcomes. I'll now turn the webinar over to Dr. Mattis and his presentation. Welcome, Dr. Mattis.
Oh, thanks very much, Barbara. A pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the Michigan Bean Commission for giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts about the recent dietary guidelines process. So to begin, I think I'm going to need someone to advance the slides for me. Okay, to begin, here is my disclosures. I do serve on a few advisory boards and have some industry partnered research underway, but I honestly don't think any have direct bearing on the presentation today. Next slide. We've already gone through that. Next slide. Okay, so to begin with, I understand that this is a diverse audience and not everybody is familiar with the dietary guidelines process. So just sort of quickly go through that. So to begin with, the dietary guidelines really provide the foundation for setting policies for all federally funded feeding programs, from school lunch to feeding the elderly to SNAP, feeding in the military, and so on. So while we're at a point in time where we are moving towards more precision nutrition and individualized approaches, there is still a great relevance and importance for population-based recommendations. The dietary guidelines have enormous impact on feeding in America. Second point to make is that the guidelines are based on the preponderance of scientific evidence at the time. So the process is a 5-year cycle, and different questions are handled each cycle. And when the questions are addressed, recommendations are made with the available knowledge, knowing that it is imperfect. Also, many of you may work for commodity groups or other groups that have an interest in a particular nutrient or food or whatever. And I know the process is often frustrating for you because much of the science that you fund and see doesn't show up in the review process for the dietary guidelines. And the reason for that is that there is some limit to capacity to review the totality of the evidence, but we have to make recommendations that are broadly generalizable, that apply to the whole population, not limited subsamples of them. So the smaller studies do inform the larger studies, but by and large, the evidence reviewed for the dietary guidelines is larger epidemiologic type studies and large randomized controlled trials. This particular round, the 2020 dietary guideline process, was the first to include consideration of the evidence related to infants and toddlers, so really covered the entirety of the lifespan. Next slide, please. As I said, the process repeats itself every 5 years, and it really starts in earnest about 2.5 years before each anniversary date. So for the 2020 process, it started in 2018. Early in that year, there was a call for comments about what questions would be most important to answer in this cycle. And the public was welcome to supply suggestions for that. Then the call was put out for nominations for people to serve on the committee. 20 were selected. This is the largest committee ever since the process began. And then once the committee was constituted, they met on 6 occasions. And several of those were public meetings where the public could attend, observe, and make comments at the meeting. So the whole process really took a very full 2 years to run through. Next slide. I mentioned that it was open to the public for comments, and we did receive quite a few, indeed 62,000 of them. Written comments, and another 125 comments from individuals that participated in the one-on-one meetings, face-to-face meetings that the committee held. I will say the 62,000 is a bit of a distortion. There were about 4,000 independent comments, but some were documents with large numbers of people that signed on to the document. Nevertheless, a good deal of feedback was provided to the committee by the public. Next slide. And I want to make it clear that there really is a 2-step process here. There was the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, and that committee is the group that informs the formation of the dietary guidelines. So that committee actually reviews the science and writes its report. And that report is then provided to the US Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services. And it is those two agencies that actually take the science and the recommendations from the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee and turns it into the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, the actual policy document. And so the target for the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is USDA and HHS. The USDA and HHS is targeting the population. Next slide, please. To get the work done, the committee this time broke into 8 working groups that covered 6 topics, and there was also a subcommittee that covered cross-cutting issues and another on data analysis and food pattern modeling. We're going to focus today on findings from 2 of those committees, beverages and added sugars, and frequency of eating. Next slide. Now, the way the committee set about its work is it had really 3 distinct approaches for reviewing the science. The first we'll just call data analysis, and that's based on a critical evaluation of the large nationally representative databases, things like NHANES and What We Eat in America. And there were about 150 analyses that were completed for the 2020 Dietary Guidelines review process. Second, there's a food pattern modeling component. And the goal here was to take existing knowledge and then evaluate it through modeling techniques to determine what the implications would be if current practices, feeding practices, were modified. For example, choosing more nutrient-dense foods than is customarily consumed, and trying to determine what the health outcomes of that might be. And then the third process is called the NESR Systematic Review, and NESR stands for Nutrition Evidence Systematic Review. And this is the process where the original research literature is screened and reviewed. More than 270,000 citations were screened through the process for the 2020 guidelines. 1,500 original research articles were included in the analysis, and they were used to conduct 33 original systematic reviews. So I'll share findings from each of those approaches with you. Next slide. To be clear, the committee determines how that literature review will be conducted. This is not guided by outside forces. I know there is a fair amount of concern every time the committee is formed about industry influence on the process. But the reality is, once the committee is constituted, they have complete control over the process. And for each of the questions that were posed to them, they created a rubric similar to the one that you see here, where they identified the interventions and exposures that were relevant, what the comparator groups should be, what the endpoints, what the outcomes should be, and any key confounders that might have to be weighed in the evaluation of the literature. So we actually spent months just working through the system to define how the literature would in fact be reviewed, so that it was transparent, it was objective, and we stuck very closely to the system that we defined. Next slide. This is just reiterating that the system was controlled by the committee, and the NESR staff was only there to support the committee. They actually physically tracked down the literature, compiled it for the committee, but all interpretation, all analyses of the literature was done by the committee. And this time, for the first time, the report from the advisory committee was actually sent out for peer review by federal scientists. Next slide. This all culminated in a report, a rather lengthy one, 835 pages, that was published on July 15th. And that's the report that was sent to USDA and HHS. And they used that to write and issue the actual dietary guidelines for Americans, which came out, I think, December 29th, just before the end of the year. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the two questions that I mentioned at the beginning. We'll start with added sugars. So the charge to the committee, if I could have the next slide, was to look at added sugars, and the rationale for this was pretty clear, that overweight and obesity are very prevalent in the population. It's no surprise to anybody. Next slide, next advance, yep. And it's true in adults, and it's true in youth. We're up actually now over 40% of the adult population with obesity, and over 20% of youth with obesity. Next. And so the committee was asked a series of questions, and one had to do with how added sugars was related to growth size, body composition, and risk of overweight and obesity. Next. We also were asked to look at the association with type 2 diabetes, and the third was with cardiovascular disease. In the end, we didn't actually have the time to go into type 2 diabetes, so we only looked at the evidence related to body weight and with cardiovascular disease. We had to start with the definition of what an added sugar is, and that is actually somewhat controversial. So we decided to go with a very well-established definition put out by the Food and Drug Administration, which basically says it's any packaged sugar or any form of concentrated sugars from fruits or vegetables that are present at a concentration greater than would be encountered when present in the actual food itself. Next slide. So one question was the relationship between added sugars and body composition. And after the review of the published original research, the committee concluded that there was moderate evidence linking high sugar sweetened beverage consumption intake with greater adiposity. And I emphasize sugar sweetened beverage here because the literature was not adequate to isolate the effect of added sugars from the fact that about 40% of added sugars are derived from sweetened beverages. And so much of the literature on added sugars is really a literature on sweetened beverages. And so one has to be cautious in interpreting this data. The evidence is based on beverages. And so the association was viewed as moderate for children and only limited for adults. Next slide. With respect to cardiovascular disease, there were a few more endpoints that were considered, and the evidence was viewed as limited for cardiovascular disease mortality and insufficient for other outcomes related to this, such as heart failure, stroke, peripheral artery disease, and so on. Next slide. Again. So that was based on the systematic review. In terms of the data analysis, there was precedent for setting a recommendation of less than 10% of energy from added sugars. The World Health Organization, the 2015 Dietary Guidelines, and Healthy People 2020 all converge on this recommendation of less than 10% of energy. Next slide. So where do we stand? These recommendations have been out now for some time. Well, only about 50% of children 1 to 3 years of age are consuming, sorry, not only, about 50% of children 1 to 3 years of age are consuming greater than 10% of energy from added sugars. Next. That goes up to about 75% for children 4 to 18 years of age. Next. And about 60% of men. Next. And similarly, about 60% of women are all still consuming greater than 10% of energy from added sugars. So we have a long way to go there. Next slide. Next, please. And again. Okay, so what do we know about, in a little bit more detail, what the actual consumption is in the population now? And the review of the federally derived, nationally representative databases suggests that about 13% of daily energy intake is derived from added sugars. Next. And that works out to about 16 teaspoons of sugar on a given day for all Americans 2 years of age and older. Next. And at the 75th percentile of the population, this translates to about 400 kilocalories a day for males and about 300 kilocalories per day for adult females. Next. And interestingly, about 70% of added sugars are derived from just 5 food categories, and they're shown best on the next slide. And these categories are sweetened beverages, desserts and sweet snacks, coffee and tea with sugar added, candy and sugars, and breakfast cereals and bars. And while the contribution of each varies across the lifespan, they actually work out to be very consistent within a age category. So for example, sweetened beverages are consumed more in greater quantity by adolescents and young adults than young children and older individuals, whereas coffee and tea provide more added sugars to older individuals and much less to very young, to children and adolescents. But if you go within an age bracket, you can see they all sum to about 70% of total added sugars. Next slide. And so what that means is that this is really a target for intervention. If we want to reduce the contribution of added sugars in the diet, focusing on these 5 categories would probably be most productive. And the one that gets singled out most often is the sugar sweetened beverages. They contribute more than any other category, about 37, maybe even up to 40% of added sugars. And frequently, not necessarily, but frequently, they provide that sugar without a lot of other nutrients. And so it is a place to reduce energy intake, reduce sugar intake without compromising the consumption of nutrients that are needed. Next slide. Okay, now interestingly, the contribution, the proportion of the population that consumes greater than 10% of energy from added sugars is actually decreased from 70% in 2007 to 2010 to 63% in 2013 to 2016. So there has been meaningful substantive reduction over time in meeting this goal. However, next slide. At the same time, over this same time frame, total energy intake actually didn't change at all. It went from 2,065 kcals as a mean in the population to 2,058. And the reason energy intake did not go down despite a reduction in added sugars is because intake of saturated fat increased. Not by a great amount, but enough to offset the reduction in added sugars. So one of the goals, of course, of reducing added sugars is to reduce energy intake, but that has not been realized, at least to date. Next slide. So these 5 food categories, if I could have next maybe 2 or 3 advanced. Yep, one more. It's important to point out that, yes, they contribute added sugar, and that is energy that may put individuals in positive energy balance and promote weight gain. But it's also important to recognize, particularly in the form of bars and cereals, that the foods that contribute these added sugars also contribute useful nutrients to the diet. About 70% of total grains, greater than 40% of whole grains, greater than or equal to 20% of dairy intake across the lifespan, and 15 to 18% of a number of nutrients and food components, some of which are in short supply, things like calcium, potassium, dietary fiber, and vitamin D. So one has to fight the urge to just say, oh, we must ban added sugars altogether. A more nuanced approach is needed because they can come with important nutrients. And so that has to be factored into any dietary advice. Next, please. Okay, then we move on to the food pattern modeling evidence. And there were really 3 exercises that were conducted by this approach. The first was to see to what degree added sugars could be incorporated in the diet while still meeting nutrient needs and not exceeding energy bounds. Second, to explore how reducing these added sugars may impact the overall quality of the diet. And also what changes in food choices would be necessary to achieve energy balance and meeting energy goals in the long run. So next slide, please. The committee created this table and we'll look at 2,000 kilocalories as an example of how added sugars, what level of added sugars can be incorporated into the diet. Since as I said, the mean intake in the population now is 2,065. So this is really looking at the mean energy intake of the population. And what the modeling showed was that if one made food choices based on nutrient-dense foods, that it would still take about 88% of those 2,000 kilocalories to meet nutrient goals. So 1,759 kilocalories would be needed from nutrient-dense foods to meet goals. That means there's only 241 kilocalories left to consume without exceeding energy bounds. And if we assume a 55-45 split between saturated fats and added sugars, which is typical of what is seen in the diet in the population, then that works out to about 16 grams of solid fats and about 27 grams of added sugars. And if you do the math on that, it works out to only about 5% of energy can be obtained from added sugars and not exceed energy bounds on a 2,000 kilocalorie diet. And if you look at that right-hand column, diets ranging from 1,000 kilocalories up to 2,800 kilocalories, so pretty much covering the range in the population, that percentage really never goes above 6%. It's only when one gets up over 3,000 kilocalories a day does it rise even slightly. And this was the basis for the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, is making the recommendation that 6% should be the target rather than 10%, as had previously been the case. Next slide. Now, I've already pointed out that there is a bit of a reciprocity here between discretionary intake of saturated fat and added sugars. So this table shows just how much latitude there is in that. So again, using 2,000 kilocalories as just the model system, if one were to take all saturated fat out of the diet, then the amount of added sugars that could be included and remaining within energy bounds could go up as high as 12%. Similarly, if you took all the sugar out, then saturated fat could go up. But it's very, very unlikely that individuals will follow a diet that absolutely excludes either of those sources of energy, saturated fat or added sugars. So we're really working within the middle zone there, the 55-45 variance in, increasing or decreasing from the mean. And again, you can see that what that means in terms of percent of energy from added sugars remains in the 5 to 6 percentile category. Next slide. And if you were to reduce added sugars down to that 5 to 6% level and redistribute those calories in the form of nutrient-dense foods, could they actually impact the degree to which dietary guidelines are being met? So just as an example here, I've just arbitrarily picked out males 4 to 8 years of age. And wherever you see a yellow and red star, it means that by saving those calories from added sugars and investing them into more nutrient-dense foods, each of those categories of patterns, different food groups that one would like to achieve can be met, so that we can meet the recommendation for fruits and for vegetables, dark green vegetables, red orange vegetables, and so on, and also dairy. So redistributing that energy can make a very substantive positive impact on total diet quality. Next slide. The same is true for females. Redistributing them helps to meet nutrient goals. Next slide. And that just sums up what I said. Again, okay, now I want to emphasize the importance of this concept of choosing nutrient-dense foods as opposed to the customary food choices that we do make. If I could have the next slide, please. What's shown in the bottom bar is the intake from different food groups that could reasonably be assimilated so that all nutrient needs were met without exceeding 2,000 kilocalories a day. But that's based on very smart, nutrient-dense food choices. If food groups are met by using more conventional foods, then there's more energy associated with them. And as a result, positive energy balance occurs at the tune of about 260, 265 kilocalories. And that's where we see the weight gain occurring in the population, that the choices that are being made are more energy dense than what the modeling shows needs to occur if we're to remain within energy bounds. Next slide. So to summarize the evidence on added sugars, positive energy balance is a major public health problem. Next. And that added sugars provide energy often with limited nutrient content, so they are a place to focus interventions. About 70% of added sugars are derived from just 5 food categories, so one can target those even more specifically. Next, that based on nutrient-dense food choices, added sugars should really probably contribute less than 6% of energy, and that based on customary food choices, it will be very hard to stay within energy bounds and still meet nutrient goals. Next. But if we are able to bring about dietary change towards more nutrient-dense foods, it really, that amount of energy saved can be much more productively used and help meet nutrient goals. Next. Having said that, I want to reiterate that added sugars do add palatability to a diet, and quality of life is also an important concept and reality for people. And if a diet is healthful but not consumed because it's not palatable, then nobody's going to derive the benefit from it. So striking some realistic balance between the inclusion of added sugars and making smarter food choices has to be the target here. Next slide. Okay, let me move on to the issue of eating frequency and provide just a little background here for why this was a question. This is the first time that the Dietary Guidelines Committee considered the evidence related to frequency of eating. As you all know, total energy intake is really a function of portion size, so how much you eat when you eat, and eating frequency, so how frequently you eat those different portions. And one cannot talk about energy intake without balancing those two components to dietary behavior. They are reciprocal too. One can eat large portions, and if you eat them infrequently, you can maintain energy balance, or you can eat very frequently as long as portion size is reduced. The problem is when you eat large portions frequently, and that unfortunately is what we have been doing for some time now. Next slide. And the result of not having one of those two arms offset the other is that overweight and obesity occur. These are data derived from a different database, but show pretty much what I showed before. Around 40% of the population now has obesity. Next slide. And that is continuing to increase. Next slide. Now, why is eating frequency worth looking at in isolation? There has been a fair amount of evidence reviewed on portion size. We know that portion sizes have been going up, and I don't for a moment want to suggest that that's not an important contributor to positive energy balance and a public health target. But less attention has been paid to eating frequency. And I show these data based on the Adventist health study. And the reason I like to show these data is that Seventh-day Adventists tend to have quite healthy lifestyles. Rates of smoking and alcohol use are low. They're a highly educated group as a whole. They exercise regularly. So it's a group where eating frequency can be evaluated quite independently of many other dietary attributes that may contribute to positive weight gain and adverse health outcomes. And what you can see is that in this group, there is a very clear linear relationship between eating frequency and change in BMI. So that eating frequency is a target worthy of independent consideration. So with all of that background, the Dietary Guidelines Committee took on the question of eating frequency. Next slide. Oh, I should point out one other thing, and that is if one looks at eating frequency in the NHANES database, what you will see is that there is an inverse association shown here in the green bars. That is, the more frequently people eat, the lower is their BMI. That's counter to what I was just saying. And the reason it's counter is because it's probably an artifact of inaccurate dietary reporting. Because if one controls for estimating energy, underestimating energy intake, corrects for that, then the pattern that emerges is the blue bars showing that there is a positive association between eating frequency and BMI. And these are the data for men. If I could have the next slide. The exact same holds for women. The raw data shows inverse, but the corrected data shows a positive association. Okay, next slide. So with this backdrop, the question seemed very relevant to look at eating frequency, and it was recognized that it's actually more multidimensional than just how frequently people eat, because how frequently one eats also alters their metabolism, alters endocrine function, and alters digestive processes. So there is a whole physiological dimension to eating frequency on top of the impact on food choice and the temporal patterns involved. Next slide. And next again, good. So the questions posed to the Committee on Eating Frequency had to do, if I could have a couple, I think 4 or 5. Yes, good. Had to do with meeting nutrient goals and the effects of eating frequency on, again, growth, size, body composition, and risk of overweight and obesity, all cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes. Next. The first issue that the committee had to grapple with was, how do you define eating frequency? It's anything but straightforward. Should one count only meals? Should snacks be counted? Should they be evaluated independently or collectively? Next. Should eating occasions include instances where no energy is consumed? What if you just have a glass of water or a diet soda? Next slide. Should energy and nutrients or types of foods, different types of foods be considered? Is something a snack if it's one kind of food and a meal and another, and so viewed as differentiated or not? Next. Should caloric beverages alone be considered an eating event? Next. And then there's the whole temporal issue. If you're sitting at a table for a very long period of time with long gaps between courses, are those different eating events, or is it one eating event because you've been sitting in one place? Coming up with a clear definition there is not easy. Next. What interval in time has to pass before one is willing to say that one eating event ended and another has begun? Next. And I think you get the idea. There are a lot of important questions here. Next slide. So what the committee did was they adopted the following definition, that an eating occasion includes consumption of solid foods or beverages, including water, that is either energy yielding or non-energy yielding. That is anything that passes through your lips. And the reason for this is that even water alters digestion, alters nutrient absorption, alters metabolism in a broader way. So it's not innocuous, it's not irrelevant. It is an ingestive event that has physiological meaning. Anything ingested was included in the definition for eating frequency. Next slide. And I think it's very important to recognize just how critical the definition one uses is. This is a paper that I was part of a group that published recently and just looked at different definitions of snacking. So in one case, snacks defined by the consumer, another snacks defined by the consumer, but limiting it only to snacks of at least 50 kilocalories. So we took out snacks that were just diet soda or a cup of coffee with a teaspoon of sugar in it or whatever. Or snacks with other eating occasions, so self-defined snacks, but where other eating occasions were observed, they were counted, or if they also contain more than 50 kilocalories. So just looking at these different definitions, next slide, you can see that the count of eating frequency of eating occasions can vary by more than twofold. And so that makes a big difference in how one calculates the association between eating frequency and health outcomes. Next slide. And just as some evidence for this, one way to measure adiposity is through the sagittal abdominal diameter, shown here with a person in the recumbent position using a stadiometer to measure abdominal diameter. And if you go to the next slide, please. One finds that for individuals that have high eating occasions, so 4 or more eating, snacking, sorry, not just eating, snacking occasions per day, there is a positive association between SAD, the sagittal abdominal diameter, and eating frequency. Not so visible at lower frequencies, but at high end, the association does shine through. Next slide, please. Okay. Next, we go on to the data analysis and what we know about eating frequency in the population currently. Next slide. So on average, the US population reports about 5.7 eating occasions per day. Next, that the US population still consumes 3 meals per day most of the time, 64% of the population, at least 2 meals a day for another 28% of the population. So meal eating is still alive and well, but we are adding 2 to 3 snacking events per day on average. Next slide. And so the frequency of eating is very high. About 93% of the population snacks on a regular basis. Next slide. And that these snacks are contributing about somewhere between 20 and 25% of total energy, which is a very substantial contribution if you think of it relative to breakfast, which only contributes about 18% of energy in the population on an average day. So snacks are providing more energy than one of our primary meals every day. Next slide. Late night eating is a particularly interesting phenomenon in that it tends to be dominated by foods that are contributing components that are recommended to be reduced in intake. Next. And that snacks alone provide about 35% of total added sugars. And we just talked about the importance of added sugars and limiting those. So snacking is important in that regard too. Next slide. Yeah.
I just want to let you know you have about 10 minutes left so that we have time for Q&A.
Yeah. I'm going to whiz through this now. Okay, next slide. Okay, so there were 5 questions that were posed with respect to eating frequency and health outcomes. And the systematic review on this was strikingly uninformative. There just is not an adequate database for addressing each of the questions. So rather than belaboring this, next slide. And the next slide. Again, so we had 6 studies to look at overweight and obesity and decided there was insufficient evidence to even address that question. And you can go through the next slides rather quickly. There was no evidence for all-cause mortality, for cardiovascular disease, for type 2 diabetes. And so no conclusions could be reached. And we'll skip over these next 2. Next. Okay, so the summary on eating frequency is that overweight and obesity are again very prevalent. Next. Snacking is ubiquitous, occurring in 93% of the population. We're eating 2 to 3 snacks per day. They contribute about a quarter, 20 to 25% of total energy, and that we really don't have the evidence to determine what impact that has on health outcomes at this point. Next. And we'll go on. Okay, so I do want to end with on a more positive note. What were the real take-home messages from the advisory committee's report and the subsequent dietary guidelines for Americans themselves? And the main points are that we should be taking a life stage approach, which means that it's never too late to start a good diet. If one wasn't eating the best diet at some point in life, one can start, and that will lead to benefits down the road. At every stage, if we enter in a better place, we will likely end at a better place. That dietary patterns should really be the core of the assessment of dietary quality. Individual nutrients, individual foods are a poor way to judge quality. It's really overall pattern, and what that means is there is no one optimal diet. Not any single identifiable named diet is right for everybody. Each individual has to find what works best for their lifestyle and their needs, and there are many ways to create a healthful diet. Next slide. And we have a lot of work to do to get there. Most food groups are not being consumed in appropriate amounts. Next slide. And the Healthy Eating Index, which is an index of the degree to which the population is meeting dietary guideline recommendations, is stubbornly stuck at only a score of in the 50s, and 100 is the goal. So we're far from where we want to be. Next slide. And so the bottom line is there are foods that are to be encouraged for consumption, and those include fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, low-fat dairy products, and unsaturated oils. And there are some foods that we probably should be reducing consumption of. And then the next slide. Those include red meat, high-fat meat and dairy products, sugar-sweetened beverages, added sugars, and sodium. So not a great surprise, but after a very thorough review of the literature, the evidence really confirmed the wisdom of identifying these patterns and trying to use those to guide better food choices in the population. And with that, I think I'll stop and try to take a couple of questions.
Thank you very much, Rick. That was really an excellent presentation of very deep dive into some of the processes related to the dietary guidelines. You're right, we have time for just a few questions. And I have one here. It wants to know, did the guideline recommendations about plant-based eating change significantly compared to the 2020 recommendations? What's your thoughts?
Are you saying the dietary guidelines versus the dietary guidelines advisory committee, or the 2020 versus the 2015?
The 2025 versus the 2020 related to the dietary guidelines advisory committee.
Okay, just for clarity, there was the 2015 guidelines and the 2020 guidelines. Okay, bottom line is, no, there is an emphasis on plant-based eating as a way to achieve meeting the goals without exceeding energy-based guidelines. But it is not the only way to do it. I really want to emphasize the importance of flexibility and looking at dietary patterns. One can certainly develop and follow a healthy diet that includes meat and poultry and dairy products and so on. But a plant-based diet tends to lend itself more easily to meeting the goals that were enumerated in the report.
And then just because you had worked and you said this was a new area related to eating frequency, what was the biggest surprise to you as you were reviewing the research related to eating frequency in the US?
Well, unfortunately, the biggest surprise was the lack of sound evidence to draw conclusions. We all went into this with very high hopes of being able to provide detailed guidance to clinicians and policymakers. But in the end, the literature just was not adequate to make those kinds of recommendations. So the primary outcome of that part of the process was to identify future directions and the kind of research that we really need to do in the next few years, so that the 2025 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee will have the necessary evidence to draw appropriate conclusions.
Okay. You mentioned saturated fat and added sugar as the discretionary calories. Could you repeat what the percentage of total calories the two of those together represent?
Well, so the conventional diets provide about 55, on average, about 55% of energy, of the discretionary energy as saturated fat, and about 45% as added sugars. The goal for those is to be less than about 10% of energy. Now, if you believe the advisory committee report rather than the guidelines themselves, that should be even less, down around 6%. But where we are as a population now is around 13% of energy.
All right. And a last question about protein requirements. Given the emerging body of protein research around the optimization of protein, that is grams per meal versus grams per day, how is that considered in reporting consumption rates? I.e., if you are consuming 1.2 grams per kilogram, is that really overconsumption?
Yeah, so protein is an unusual nutrient in that it really is not appropriate to report it in terms of energy needs. It really has to be based more on an absolute sense. So I'm hesitant. That's a much more nuanced question than I think I can answer at this time.
All right, great. Well, Dr. Mattis, thank you very much. This was, again, an excellent, excellent presentation. That's all the time we have right now for questions. Once again, the Michigan Bean Commission would like to thank Dr. Mattis for sharing his expertise on this topic. And the topic of formulating dietary guideline recommendations, eating frequency, and added sugars. This webinar covered the process for formulating national dietary recommendations, the contribution of added sugars and their moderation to meet dietary goals, the trends in eating frequency and their health implications, and fundamental dietary patterns identified that contribute to positive health outcomes. The Michigan Bean Academy webinar series has a few last-minute details. For those of you who are looking for continuing education credits, the certificate is available by going to the michiganbean.com/health professional webinar section. The recording of today's webinar will also be available at the same location to download. I'd like to invite everybody to attend the next Michigan Bean Academy webinar that is called Building a Foundation for Closing the Dietary Fiber Gap, Improving Gut Health Through a Diverse Diet. Our presenter will be Dr. Henry Thompson from Colorado State University. It is on April 22nd, and you can register right now on the Michigan Bean Commission website. So once again, thank you for joining our inaugural webinar and making it a strong success by your presence. Please join us and sign and fill out a brief survey that you will see online when you end the webinar. Thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.